Good morning once again, or good afternoon as the time slot may be. We're meeting once today to learn the second part of the grammar component of Unit 1 for this third semester, and this is the Passé Composé. Now, what is the Passé Composé? It is nothing but the past tense in French. So let us find out how we go about it. The Passé Composé and its uses. The Passé Composé is a frequently used past tense. It is the most frequently used past tense, apart from something that we'll be learning soon known as the imparfait. But the first one we normally touch on is the Passé Composé because it's very related to the present tense. It is a compound tense. Now, what do we mean by this? It has two elements. It is composed of two words. It is composed of two words. It is not a simple verb. It is composed of two words. And it is used to highlight short actions, very precise actions, easily defined actions which have clear timelines, and brisk narration of facts. So it is a very precise tense. It is not vague. It is not monotonous. It is used to recount facts in a very precise and fast and vibrant manner. Everybody is scared of the Passé Composé, and everybody asks the question, est-ce difficile? And as a teacher, I have to say, no, c'est très facile. Il faut simplement concentrer. Alright? Even I had problems with the Passé Composé as a student. I don't blame you. You always have this vague feeling that the Passé Composé is difficult. It isn't. You just have to learn and concentrate and apply what you learn your structures, and it doesn't become easy overnight. It takes time, but at the end of this lesson, maybe at the end of the next lesson, at the end of the semester, you would have perfectly mastered it. Alright? Now, further ado, let's go down into its formation ou bien la composition ou la formation. Le Passé Composé, as you can see, the Passé Composé has two parts. Alright? The first part is the auxiliary verb or le verbe auxiliaire, and the second part is the past participle ou bien le participe passé. And once again, the auxiliary verb has two types, the verb être and the verb avoir, which we learned way back in the first semester when I told you that these two verbs you have to memorize, you cannot forget, because you will be learning them, repeating them all through your life. Okay? Now, there it is. At the top over here, I have given you the structure of the past tense. Passé Composé is equal to auxiliary verb followed by your past participle. Alright? Whereas the present tense, you just have one verb. Here you have two parts. You have the auxiliary followed by your past participle. Okay? So in the present tense, you have only one simple verb. And the Passé Composé, remember, composé means it is composed of. Therefore, there are two parts in it. One is the auxiliary, which is easy for you to remember. It is the verb être or avoir. And the second one is the past participle or le participe passé. Okay, let's go ahead. So how do you conjugate it? You have the verbs être and avoir. I've given them to you here. J'ai, tu as, il, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils, elles ont. This is the verb avoir. It means to have. Huh? And in case you've forgotten the verb être, here they are. Je suis, tu es, il, elle est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils, elles sont. Now remember, along with elle and il, you have to memorize the pronoun on. Forgive my writing with the mouse. I'm quite terrible with the mouse when it comes to writing. So along with il and elle, you have to remember that this is also valid for the pronoun on. So this is your auxiliary present tense. Remember it. Do not forget it. J'ai, tu as, il, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils, elles ont. And the être is je suis, tu es, il, elle, et on, et nous sommes, vous êtes, and ils, sont, elles sont. This is the auxiliary, the first part of your passé composé. You always need it. Remember, the confusion comes because in English you say I saw. So you look at the saw, you think of the equivalent of saw in your mind, and you put je view, and you get it wrong because you've forgotten the auxiliary. You need both. The passé composé has two elements. One is the past participle and one is the support element or the auxiliary, and both support each other and you get your past tense. So this is the first part. Always remember, your passé composé has this first compulsory part. It is either the être verb or the avoir verb. Okay. So what are the être verbs? You have to know that there are certain verbs that are conjugated only with être, and there are certain verbs that are conjugated only with avoir. So let us concentrate on the être verbs because they are few in number, and if you memorize those correctly, you should automatically know that every other verb is conjugated with avoir. Now, in school, they would have taught you this complicated way of memorizing Dr. Mrs. Van de Tramp. I do not recommend that because everybody remembers Dr. Mrs. Van de Tramp. They don't remember what Dr. Mrs. Van de Tramp stands for, and they end up thinking of verbs that have nothing to do with the auxiliary être. Okay, so how do I know which verbs are conjugated with the auxiliary être? Remember, the first clue is they are synonyms of the verb aller or venir. Aller means to go, venir means to come. So any verb that is a synonym of these verbs are conjugated with the verb être. And then all your reflexive verbs, all your SE verbs, the verbs we learned in the first part of this lesson, your reflexive pronominal verbs, all those verbs, as long as they have SE in front of them, they automatically are conjugated by your auxiliary être. Okay, now let's apply these to these total verbs over here. Okay, this is your first element, this is your second group, and this is your third group. Okay, now in dark red I have given you three verbs. One is naître, devenir, and mourir. They are verbs that relate to state, the state of a body. You're born, you take time, you become somebody, and then you die. They describe the state of your body. All three are conjugated with être. They describe the state of a body, right? The basic state of a body. And then you have the verb aller, sortir, and partir, along with the verb over here, passer. They are synonyms of the verb aller, to go out. Then over here you have the verb venir, revenir, retourner, arriver, rentrer, and entrer. All of them are synonyms of the verb venir. You also have the verb rester, which is a state. You remain somewhere, you're immobile, you remain. Descendre is to go down a flight of stairs or a mountain. Monter is the opposite, to climb up. And if you slip on the way, tomber, you fall. So these are your être verbs. Remember, they can be a state, naître, devenir, mourir. You can add rester here if you want. They can be synonyms of aller, sortir, partir. They can be synonyms of venir, revenir, retourner, arriver, rentrer, entrer. Think of a mountain. You either remain at the bottom, you go up, you come down, or you fall. Alright? Passé is a bit special. Now let's look at the word passé. Now passé has two meanings. I passed somebody on the street. I walked past him. Or I spent time, I passed some time with somebody. Okay, so you have two meanings for the verb passé. So when you're walking and it's a synonym of passé, I passed Mr. Ramanathan on the street. I walked past him. In that case, Passé's auxiliary is être. Alright, that's what I have marked over here when it means to pass by somebody. Whereas if I was spending time with my friends, I pass some time with them. In that case, the auxiliary is avoir. So passé, remember, is a very special verb. Depending on the meaning of the verb, you have two auxiliaries. Alright. Of course, the other verbs that have this double auxiliary, we'll see them later. What is important for now is the only verb you have to concentrate on that has two meanings is the verb passé. And passé is a synonym of walking. It is être. When passé is a synonym of pass time with somebody, the auxiliary is avoir. Now, these are your avoir verbs. Everything else is your avoir. Vouloir is to want, pouvoir is can or to be able to, voir is to see, prendre is to take. You have lire, which is to read, faire, which is to make or to do, and then you have mettre, which is to put. So all these verbs and every other verb that is not covered by être is necessarily covered by avoir. Okay, so these are your auxiliaries. Let's go on to the past participle. How do I form the past participle? We know the auxiliaries now. You have a few verbs that are conjugated with être and everything else is conjugated with avoir. Now let us look at the past participle. How do I form it? Regular verbs. Regular ER verbs. I replace the ER ending with E, accent aigu. So I basically just remove the R and I replace the E with a accent aigu. Alright, so instead of manger, M-A-N-G-E-R, I have manger, same pronunciation, but this time ending with the E accent aigu. IR verbs. How do I form the past participle of IR verbs? I very simply just remove the auxiliary R. For ER verbs, I remove the auxiliary R and I add an accent. For IR verbs, I just remove the auxiliary R. So my past participle ends with I. Now, what do I do for RE verbs? I take the entire ending and I replace it with the letter U. So my past participle is A-T-T-E-N-D. Instead of R-E, I have U. Now this is for regular verbs. Remember, I remove the ER, I replace it with E, accent aigu. I remove the IR, I replace it with the I remove the RE, and I replace it with a U. These are for regular verbs. Everything else is irregular naturally, and remember there is no pattern, so you have to spend some time and memorize them. Regular verbs there's a pattern, irregular verbs there is no pattern, you have to spend some time and remember them. Okay. So here are some irregular past participles. I'm not giving you the past participle for regular verbs because it's simple. You have three rules that you have to follow. ER, remove the ER, replace it with a E with an accent, the correct accent. IR, just remove the R. RE, remove the RE and replace it with U. Now let's go on to the irregulars. Jot it down if you want because we're going to have a questionnaire on this soon. So for venir, what is the past participle? It is venu, V-E-N-U. Now this is the same thing for revenir. This is the same thing for devenir. I just have to put R-E or D-E in front of it. Whenever you see a verb that has venir in it, remember that you just replace the venir with venu. Vivre, which is to live, vécu, prendre, pris. Now remember, prendre is also connected to apprendre, which is to learn, and comprendre, which is to understand, and surprendre, which is to be surprised. So all of them, remove the prendre and replace it with P-R-I-S. Être, écrire is écrit, être is été, avoir, eu, naître, which is to be born, né. Conduire is to drive, voir is to see, éteindre is to switch off, mettre is to put, faire to make or to do, lire is to read, mourir, mort, Savoir is su, pouvoir is pu, devoir is dû, boire is bu. Now devoir has an accent on the U. Every other verb in this category does not have an accent on the U. Recevoir is reçu, which also means receipt, by the way. Vouloir, voulu. Revenir and devenir, remember what I told you? It is just like the verb venir. So revenir becomes revenue and devenir becomes devenue. So these are your irregular, most of them. There's quite a few more, but these are the basic verbs that you have to remember. Alright, your verbs are, the past participle formation is irregular. You have to spend some time and memorize it and see. There are verbs that are conjugated with être, there are verbs that are conjugated with avoir. For example, revenir is an être verb, devenir is an être verb, recevoir is an avoir verb, vouloir is an avoir verb. So it's all mixed up. You have to look at it. You have to think about how you're going to make sense, because everybody's brain works in a different way. Mine works in a different way. If you have problems, I'll give you the tips I know. But everybody's brain works in a different way. So take some time, look at it, and try and make sense of it and memorize it. Alright? Now, rappel means reminder. Let's remember what we've learned till now. The first thing we have to remember is le passé composé a deux parties. The past tense has two parts. Les deux parties sont le verbe auxiliaire et le participe passé. The passé composé has two parts, the auxiliary verb and the past tense, the past participle. Pour former le participe passé, il faut travailler sur les terminaisons des verbes réguliers. So for regular verbs, you have to work on the endings of the infinitives. By that I mean ER verbs, the ending is replaced with a accent. IR verbs, the ending is replaced with I. RE verbs, the ending is replaced with U. Pour les verbes irréguliers, il faut mémoriser. For irregular verbs, you must memorize. Alright? Okay, that is our first reminder or recap. Now, let's see whether your brain is functioning well today. The first verb I'm giving you is the verb apprendre. Think of the word prendre and you get your past participle, appris. Devoir was the only thing I told you that has a hat on top of the U, dû. Devenir is linked to the verb venir, devenu. Faire stands on its own, F-A-I-T, it also means fact. So when it's a noun, it means fact. When it's a past participle, it means done or made. Manger, classical verb, classical ER verb. Lire, lu, I read a book. Voir, vu. Sortir, IR verb. Vendre, RE verb, vendu. Okay? So if you keep thinking about your past participles, you'll soon master their irregular forms. Now, how do I conjugate them now? I know which verbs are conjugated with être. I know which verbs are conjugated with avoir. I know how to form my past participle. Now, let me put them together. So here you have them. I heard the news. In English, you have just one word, heard. In French, you have two. J'ai entendu. Alright? Auxiliary. And your second word is your past participle. Alright? Jean s'est brossé les dents. Brushed is an ordinary verb in English. In French, it is a reflexive verb. So you have three parts in it. You have your pronoun, you have your auxiliary, you have your past participle. So ordinary verb has just two parts in it. Auxiliary, past participle. A reflexive verb has a third bit in it, because now you have to remember that is also your reflexive pronoun. Now let us look at the conjugation for aller. Je suis allé, tu es allé, il est allé, elle est allée, nous sommes allés, vous êtes allés, ils sont allés, and elles sont allées. If you look at the conjugation for verbs with avoir, j'ai pu, I could, I was able to. Tu as pu. Il, elle, on a pu. Nous avons pu. Vous avez pu. Ils ont pu. Elles ont pu. Now, what is the basic difference between these two? Look at the ending of your past participle. For être verbs, if je is feminine, I have to add an extra e. For avoir, I do not have this problem. Tu can be a boy, tu can be a girl. Depending on the context, I have a single e or a double e. Avoir verbs don't have this problem. Il is a boy, so I don't need to worry. It is only one form. Elle is a girl, so I have a double e. For the avoir verbs, there's no such problem. Nous is plural. These 3 or 4 things are plural. So now, apart from the masculine plural, I also have to think of a feminine plural. Alright? Masculine plural, feminine plural. This is only masculine, this is only feminine. Now, for vous, why have I given a singular form? Because vous can be singular. It is a form of formality, it is a form of respect. It can be singular, masculine, feminine. It can be plural, masculine, feminine. So this verb, this pronoun alone has 4 types. 2 for singular and 2 for plural. Everything else in the eth conjugation has only 2 types, either masculine or feminine. Alright? So this is your basic difference between être verbs and avoir verbs. Avoir verbs, now you realize, are not really a problem. You just have to conjugate, make sure you have your auxiliary verb correctly in place and your past participle correctly in place, and you get your mark. Être verbs, you have to remember, number 1, how many verbs are conjugated by être. Remember, 3 possibilities. All SE verbs are conjugated with être. All verbs of state, like being born and remaining somewhere, or becoming somebody and dying, they're all verbs of state, they're conjugated with être. All verbs that are synonyms of aller, which means to go, partir, sortir, they are all conjugated with être. And verbs that are synonyms of venir are also conjugated with être. Alright? Now, these special verbs, when you conjugate them, if your subject is feminine, you add an extra e. And if your subject is plural, you add an extra s. Is that clear? Okay. This is what we observed in the previous slide. There is a change in gender, masculine or feminine, and number, singular and plural, for past participles. For verbs that have être as the auxiliary verb, the subject matches the past participle in number and gender. So if the subject is feminine, you add an e. If the subject is plural, you add an s. This is not the case for verbs that are conjugated with avoir. Il est allé dans son bureau. Masculine, no change. Elle est allée dans son bureau. Elle has an extra e. Ils sont allés dans leur bureau. Plural, there's an extra s. And elles sont allées dans leur bureau. There's an extra e and there's an extra s. Alright? Rappel. Second reminder. Le passé composé a 2 parties. The past tense has 2 parts. These 2 parts are the auxiliary et le participe passé. There are 2 types of auxiliary, remember, être and avoir. Pour former le participe passé, il faut enlever la terminaison des infinitifs et les remplacer comme e, et, ir, i, and re, u. These are your 3 regular groups. Concernant le passé composé avec être, le sujet s'accorde en nombre et en genre avec le participe passé. The subject for être verbs matches the past participle, e for feminine and s, extra s for plural. And therefore now you have a new structure. You have subject, you have auxiliary past participle, and you have your object. So your present tense subject from last semester was only your subject, followed by your verb, followed by your object. Now remember, your verb has 2 parts, your auxiliary and your past participle. Yes? Reflexive verbs. How do you do it? We've already seen one example. Reflexive verbs are easy to recognize because the infinitive begins with the pronoun se or s. They're the se verbs. For example, se réveiller, se coucher, se manger. Of course, you eat yourself now. Se raser, se taire, to shut up. And you always start with your subject, same subject. Follow this by your reflexive pronoun, same reflexive pronoun. Your auxiliary noun is être followed by your past participle. Alright? So you have 4 parts in it. 1, 2, 3 and 4. Tu, t'es lavé. Il, elle s'est lavé. Nous nous sommes lavés. Vous vous êtes lavé. Ils se sont lavés. Elles se sont lavées. Alright? 4 parts. Okay, let's go on. Supple, like we saw earlier. In the previous slide, you have your subject. The subject is followed by your auxiliary verb. The auxiliary verb is followed by your past participle, and then you have the object. Now for reflexive verb, what happens? You have your subject followed by your pronoun, and then you have your auxiliary past participle and object. So for ordinary verbs, it is supple. For reflexive verbs, it is prapo. And of course, you have your negative form next. You have the negative form next. I love structures. Maybe you don't like structures. Maybe you can remember it easier if you remember a sentence. I've told you, if you don't like structures, remember a sentence that is conjugated correctly and you have your structure in your mind. So think of a structure like this: subject, ne, auxiliary, pa, and then you have your past participle. Your auxiliary now is your main changing tense. Past participle doesn't change. You just have additions or deletions. Only the auxiliary changes. So only the changing verb comes in between your negative. Subject, ne, auxiliary, pas, and then you have the rest of your sentence. So here it is over here. Nous n'avons pas fini le travail. So when you do the negative of the passé composé, you put ne pas around the auxiliary verb and you put the past participle outside. The same thing for your reflexive verbs. Me and suis come together now. Je ne me suis pas amusé, because me changes depending on the subject. Suis changes depending on the subject. Amusé doesn't change. I just have an extra E or an extra S. So put the changing part within your ne pas. Alright, so I've given you 2 more structures here for the negative form. Let's not look too much on these structures because I'll give you one final structure to memorize at the end. I'm just trying to help you understand how to do each part of the Passé Composé. You have ordinary sentences, you have reflexive sentences. For both, you have your negative forms. Next, how do you ask questions? The same way of asking questions, you have 3 ways to ask a question. You either invert it, or you use the suffix -sk, or you just use your voice. Alright? So how do you invert it? You have to invert the changing part, which is the auxiliary. So my sentence will be tu as mangé. And when I make it an inverted question, it becomes as-tu mangé? Alright, the auxiliary changes place. It is your changing part. Remember, leave the past participle wherever it has to be. Just change only the part that is changed for each subject. So the auxiliary now comes first, hyphen to show it is not in its normal position, and then you have your subject. You don't like that, use -sk. Think of your normal sentence and put -sk in front of it. Or just use the sound of your voice. Nous sommes arrivés. How do I make this inverted? Sommes nous arrivés? Est-ce que nous sommes arrivés? Or very simply, nous sommes arrivés. So each question, I can ask it in 3 different ways. Choose the one you are most comfortable with. and practice that for your daily speaking, but learn how to use all three, because sometimes in the tests we ask you use only est que, use only inversion, so you should be conversant with all the three forms of asking questions using the Passé Composé. Yes, I know some. Okay, so here is your basic structure. Memorize it. What you do not need is given. What is not compulsory is given within brackets, because all your sentences are not negative. All your sentences may not have a pronoun, but what is necessary is your subject, your auxiliary, and your verb. So here's your structure: subject, noun, pronoun, auxiliary, past participle, object. Alright, so your auxiliary, your subject, pronoun or proper noun, auxiliary, past participle, object. And if your sentence is negative, you add your negative forms. If your sentence has a pronoun, you add your pronoun. But this is your basic structure: subject, noun within brackets, pronoun within brackets, auxiliary needed, power within brackets, past participle needed, object if necessary is also there. So this is your basic structure. Alright, if it's a question, I invert my subject and my auxiliary. Just my subject and my auxiliary. If I'm trying to ask a question with est que, I put est que in front of my sentence. If I'm asking a question with just my voice, I have my question mark at the end of my sentence. So this is your basic structure. Is that clear? Oh dear. Now let's do some sentences. These are ordinary sentences. They're not negative, and I've given you the structure you have to follow at the side: subject, which is followed by your pronoun if necessary, and then you have your auxiliary and your past participle. So let's look at the first sentence. Le chien vient avec moi dans le train. So le chien is my subject and vient is my verb. Verb, remember, subject remains the same. Verb has two parts in it: auxiliary, past participle. Venir is your basic être verb, so there are two parts, and the first part is the verb être. And here is your sentence: Le chien est venu avec moi dans le train. See, the verb vient has become est venu. Your next sentence, this is your verb: voyons, voyons, voir. Nous voyons beaucoup de nuages, nuages, clouds. We saw, we see becomes we saw. And this is your sentence. Now, instead of voyons, you have two parts: avons, vu. This is your next verb: regarder. It's a regular ER verb. Regarder, to see. It has nothing to do with a state of mind. You're seeing something. It is not going, it is not coming. Therefore, the auxiliary is avoir. Les filles ont regardé. And then you have va. Va, you know, comes from the verb aller, to go. Therefore, it is a être verb. Thomas est allé au spectacle avec moi. And then you have one more verb here: nous rentrons. Rentrons, return, to come back. Être verb. And this is a plural subject. Therefore, I have a S. Only être verbs you have to match and see whether the subject is in sync with the past participle. Subject is masculine, no match. Subject is masculine, no match. Subject is plural, there's a match. Now, this is a SE verb, isn't it? So the auxiliary is automatically et, and the past participle has to match the subject. Laura is a girl. Laura is a girl. Laure s'est régalée. You have the subject. You have the subject followed by your pronoun here, and then you have your auxiliary, and that is what you have over here: subject, pronoun, auxiliary, and I have an E, extra E here because Laure is a girl. Je descends vite. Descends, remember the mountain, climbing up the mountain, falling down the mountain. They are être verbs, and je suis vite descendu. Now since I have imagined that I am speaking, I have added an extra E. If you think it is Thomas who's speaking, do not add an extra E. Your second verb is toi, which comes from the verb devoir, and the next is the verb oubli, which means forget. So you have 3 verbs in this sentence. Yes. Now let's go on to negatives. I've given you the structure this side, remember? But always make sure that you memorize the main structure I gave you, and that will help you sort out these questions even if I do not give you the structure. So remember, what comes within the ne pas bracket is the changing part. The pronoun that changes and the auxiliary that changes. Everything else doesn't change, leave it out of the ne pas enclosure. So the first one is already in the Passé Composé. What changes is est, so this is my negative. Le chien n'est pas venu avec moi dans le train. Avant is your changing part. Nous n'avons pas vu beaucoup de nuages. ONT is your changing part. Les filles n'ont pas regardé un film ce soir. Thomas est allé et nous sommes rentrés. Oh, my PPT skills are quite bad. So you have Laura ne s'est pas régalée pendant la fête, because remember the se changes along with the auxiliary. So both of them come within my ne pas bracket. Alright? Hopefully we'll go to Thomas. Yes. Thomas n'est pas allé au spectacle avec moi. Nous ne sommes pas rentrés tard. So finally we have 3 verbs in the last one. Suis changes, AI changes, and these are your negatives. Je ne suis pas vite descendu, je n'ai pas dû rentrer, and je n'ai pas oublié. Alright? Questions. Now remember, each sentence here has 3 possibilities. I have given you only one. Okay? So let's see the 3 parts. I've given you the possibilities here at the side. It can either be inversion, it can be est que with your sentence, or just your sentence with a question mark at the end. So the first one, le chien est-il venu avec moi dans le train? Whenever you have a subject, remember the inversion, you have to imagine what pronoun replaces the subject and invert that pronoun. You cannot invert the proper noun. You have to invert only the pronoun. So if it was just il est venu, it is easy, you say est-il venu. But since you have le chien, which is a noun, le chien est-il venu avec moi dans le train? Now the same thing, I can ask a question using est que. I can say est-ce que le chien est venu avec moi dans le train? Or just very simply, le chien est venu avec moi dans le train? Question. Okay. Next one. Est-ce que vous avez vu beaucoup de nuages? No is your answer, so you have to have vous in the question. Unless, of course, you've forgotten what you've done. So you ask your friends, did we really see a movie? Did we really see clouds yesterday? But normally, when you have nous and je in the sentence, the question is vous or tu. Again, I've used est-ce que, but I can easily invert this. Avons-nous vu beaucoup de nuages? Or est-ce que nous avons vu beaucoup de nuages? Les filles ont regardé un film ce soir. This is the easiest form. I can change it into est-ce que. Est-ce que les filles ont regardé un film ce soir? Or I can use a inversion. Les filles ont-elles regardé un film ce soir? Laura, est-ce que Laura s'est régalée pendant le repas? Thomas est-il allé au spectacle avec nous? Toi, vous êtes rentré tard? Est-ce que tu es vite descendu car tu as dû rentrer au bureau? Tu as oublié tes clés? Okay. Now what you can do is you can spend some time on these sentences and write them in 3 different forms, and you can send it to me or to your teachers, and we will help you if you have any problems. Alright? And you can practice these exercises some more. We have given you many online exercises in your LMS platform. Check them out. Do it online, and the beauty with the online exercises is the page automatically tells you whether you're right or wrong. If you still have doubts, please contact us and we will help you as much as possible. So bonne chance with the Passé Composé. Remember, it is not at all difficult. There are two parts in the Passé Composé compared to the present tense. You have two parts, the auxiliary and the past participle. You have a group of verbs that are conjugated with être and a group of verbs that are conjugated with avoir. All SE verbs are conjugated with être, and most of the être verbs, they are synonyms of aller, venir, or they speak about the state of a person. And you also have some words in connection with mountains, going up, coming down. You have a few odd verbs like passer. Sometimes they have an être or avoir as a auxiliary, but it's easy to find that out. For example, passer, when it means to walk, the auxiliary is être, and when it means to pass time, the auxiliary is avoir. So once you have that in your mind of the auxiliary, now you go to the past participle. You have regular conjugation forms of past participles, and you have irregular forms. You have to memorize the second, and then you put it together, and you can make your sentences with the basic structure that I've given you. Subjects will be sometimes negative, so you follow it with NE within brackets. Sometimes there's a pronoun on it, so you have your PR or pronoun within brackets. And then you have your auxiliary, which is compulsory for a Passé Composé. After that, you have your negative pa within brackets if you have no in the beginning. And then you have your verb, follow it with your object, follow it with your time, or the rest of your sentence. So this is your basic structure. If you keep that in your mind, you won't have any problems at all. Alright, bonne chance and see you soon.